It's kind of wild when you think about it,
Yeah.
but all those things we worry about as we get older, heart disease, cancer, the big ones, well, turns out mental health is right up there too.
Yeah, absolutely. Anxiety, depression, even things like dementia.
Right, it's not just our bodies that age, it's our minds too.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that for a long time, we've kind of treated them as separate issues, physical health over here, mental health over there.
Right, separate specialists, separate treatments.
But more and more research is showing how deeply connected they really are. And you, our listener, have always been curious about what you can actually do to improve your well-being. So we thought it would be really interesting to dive into this connection between mental and physical health.
Yeah, and I think this deep dive is going to reveal some pretty surprising stuff because we're not just talking about like, oh, stress can make you sick. We're going deeper, looking at the fundamental biological processes that might be at play here.
Right, down to the cellular level. And for that, we're going to be drawing on a conversation between Dr. Andrew Huberman and Dr. Chris Palmer on the Huberman Lab podcast.
Now, Dr. Palmer is a psychiatrist and researcher at Harvard who's been doing some groundbreaking work in this area called metabolic psychiatry. And what really caught our attention was his focus on these tiny little powerhouses inside our cells called mitochondria.
Ah, mitochondria, those fascinating little energy
Yeah,
factories.
exactly. And he makes this really compelling case that understanding how our metabolism works, and particularly the role of these mitochondria,
Hmm.
could be the key to unlocking new ways to understand and treat a whole range of mental health conditions.
He's talking about things like depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, even autism and ADHD.
Yeah, a really wide spectrum. And what's so intriguing is this idea that maybe instead of just managing symptoms, we could actually address some of the root causes of these conditions by supporting these fundamental biological processes.
Absolutely. It's about shifting our perspective from just treating the problem to actually creating the conditions for better health. And that's what we're going to explore today, pulling out some of the most interesting insights and actionable takeaways from Dr. Palmer's work.
So let's start with this whole idea of metabolic psychiatry because it sounds kind of like a new thing. But Dr. Palmer actually points out that it's not entirely new. He mentions that researchers back in the late 1800s, early 1900s were already looking at the metabolism of patients with severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder.
That's right. They were measuring things like lactate and glucose levels, trying to understand how the body was processing energy in these individuals.
But then over time, as we learned more about the brain and mental illness, the focus kind of shifted in different directions.
We started to focus more on things like neurotransmitters, the chemicals that transmit signals in the brain, things like serotonin and dopamine,
Right, and the role of psychology, like our thoughts, feelings, and experiences.
and also the impact of social factors like poverty, trauma, and discrimination.
But Dr. Palmer is saying, hey, let's not forget about this fundamental level of metabolism. It's like the foundation upon which all these other factors are built.
Exactly. It's like trying to understand how a car works without knowing anything about the engine.
Right, you might be able to tinker with the radio or the air conditioning, but if the engine's not running, nothing else really matters.
And what's so compelling about this metabolic perspective is that it can help explain how seemingly unrelated problems might actually share some common roots.
Yeah, like, for example, he points out that many of the same risk factors for heart disease, things like poor blood sugar control, chronic inflammation, are also linked to an increased risk of mental health conditions.
And to really highlight just how profound this connection can be, Dr. Palmer brings up these things called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs.
Now, these are things like experiencing abuse, neglect, witnessing violence in the home, growing up with a parent who struggles with substance abuse or mental illness.
Right. Really difficult experiences that no child should have to go through.
And we know that these ACEs can have a huge impact on someone's mental health, increasing their risk of developing things like depression, anxiety, PTSD, and even substance abuse problems later in life.
But what's really striking is that these ACEs also dramatically increase the risk of physical health problems like obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, autoimmune conditions, and even cancer.
He even shared this statistic that blew me away. People who've had 6 or more of these adverse childhood experiences can, on average, live up to 20 years less than people who haven't.
It's a really stark reminder of how deeply our early experiences shape our overall health. And when you start to think about it through the lens of metabolism, it starts to make a lot of sense.
Because if those early stressful experiences can disrupt our metabolism, and particularly the function of these mitochondria, those little energy factories inside our cells, it could set the stage for a whole cascade of health problems later in life, both mental and physical.
Exactly. And it highlights the incredible importance of early intervention and support for children who've experienced trauma or adversity, because those early years are so crucial for laying the foundation for lifelong health.
Okay, so let's talk more about these mitochondria because most of us probably remember them from high school biology as the powerhouses of the cell producing energy.
Right. But Dr. Palmer emphasizes that's a very oversimplified understanding of what they actually do,
Yeah, he jokes that if our mitochondria suddenly stopped working, we'd only last about 6 minutes.
which really underscores how vital they are. But while their primary function is to produce energy, they're also involved in a whole range of other cellular processes.
Like what kind of things?
Well, for example, they play a key role in cellular signaling, communication between cells.
Okay, so they're not just producing energy, they're helping to orchestrate how cells talk to each other.
Exactly. And they're also involved in regulating cell growth and death, protecting cells from damage, and even influencing how our genes are expressed.
Wow, so they're like these tiny little control centers inside each cell.
In a way, yes, and they're incredibly adaptable, constantly responding to the signals they receive from the environment and the body.
Which makes sense because our bodies are always having to adjust to different conditions, like changes in temperature, food availability, stress levels.
Right. And our mitochondria are right there on the front lines, helping our cells adapt and maintain balance.
So when we talk about improving our health, supporting our mitochondria is really about supporting our body's ability to adapt and thrive in a constantly changing world.
Precisely. And that's why things like exercise and good sleep, which we know are good for us, are actually impacting our health at this very fundamental mitochondrial level.
So let's talk about the brain because that's really Dr. Palmer's area of expertise. And this is where it gets really interesting because he's essentially challenging this long-held idea that mental illness is simply caused by chemical imbalances in the brain.
Yeah, like the classic example of depression being caused by low serotonin levels.
Right. And he even points out that this whole serotonin hypothesis came about almost by accident based on how some of the early antidepressant medications happen to work.
Exactly, but he's saying it's a lot more nuanced than that. Because while neurotransmitters are definitely important for how our brains function, they're not operating in isolation.
They're part of this larger metabolic system, right?
Absolutely, and that system is powered by mitochondria.
So even producing those neurotransmitters in the first place requires energy.
That's right, and the ability of our brain to change and adapt throughout our lives, that's called neuroplasticity, is also very dependent on having enough energy and healthy metabolic function provided by mitochondria.
So it's like you can't have a healthy, adaptable brain without these little powerhouses working properly.
Precisely, and when we start to think about mental health conditions through this lens of metabolism and mitochondrial function, it opens up a whole new way of thinking about treatment and prevention.
Okay, so if these mitochondria are so important, what can we do in our daily lives to keep them healthy? Dr. Palmer talks a lot about lifestyle medicine and these 6 key areas that he says are really fundamental.
And he's not shy about admitting that these might sound kind of obvious, but he emphasizes that they're really powerful for our metabolic health.
Yeah, and it's easy to dismiss things that sound simple, but sometimes the most basic things are the most important.
Absolutely. So these 6 pillars: what we eat, how we move, how well we sleep, how we manage substances like alcohol and tobacco, how we handle stress, and the quality of our relationships and sense of purpose, really form the foundation of our metabolic and mitochondrial health.
So it's like a holistic approach to well-being, taking into account all these different aspects of our lives.
Exactly. And if you ever feel overwhelmed by all the complicated health advice out there, these are the fundamental areas to focus on for a real impact on your overall well-being.
All right, so let's break them down one by one, starting with exercise, because we all know we should do it, but Dr. Palmer explains why it's so good at a cellular level.
And he uses this great example of marathon runners. They might not have huge, bulky muscles, but their muscles are packed with mitochondria.
Oh, that's interesting, because I always thought it was more about building muscle mass.
Well, building muscle definitely has its benefits, but what's really remarkable about endurance exercise is that it specifically increases the number and health of mitochondria in our muscle tissue.
So their mitochondria become more efficient at producing energy, which is why they can sustain such intense physical activity for long periods of time.
Exactly. And even if you're not training for a marathon, any regular movement you incorporate into your day is sending a powerful signal to your cells to create more and healthier mitochondria.
So it's not just about burning calories or building muscle. It's about literally upgrading your cells' energy systems.
Precisely, and that has benefits for your energy levels, your mood, your cognitive function, and your overall resilience to stress.
Okay, so movement is good. Got it. Now, on the flip side, he talks about substance use, things like stimulants, alcohol, and tobacco. And it sounds like these can put a real strain on our mitochondria.
They can, and with stimulants, it's a bit of a complex area.
How so?
Well, in low doses, they can sometimes improve brain function, particularly for conditions like ADHD, where there's often an underlying issue with dopamine signaling.
Right, so it's not like stimulants are inherently bad.
Exactly, but at higher doses, they can overwork the mitochondria, causing them to become less efficient and produce harmful byproducts.
Oh, so it's like revving your car engine too high for too long? It can eventually cause damage.
That's a good analogy, and this can lead to a state of chronic metabolic stress, which can contribute to all sorts of health problems down the road.
He even mentioned Rick Rubin, the famous music producer, and his observation about how many musicians who used a lot of stimulants early in their careers seem to have more heart problems later in life.
Yeah, it makes you think about the long-term consequences of pushing your system too hard for too long.
And what about alcohol? We know it's not good for us, but what's the specific connection to mitochondria?
Well, research has shown that the toxic effects of alcohol, particularly on the liver, are largely due to its damaging impact on mitochondria.
So it's not just about the calories or the dehydration, it's actually messing with these essential cellular components.
Right, and when our bodies break down alcohol, it creates this toxic substance called acetaldehyde, which can directly damage mitochondria.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's like a double whammy. You're both stressing the mitochondria with the metabolic process of breaking down alcohol, and then you're hitting them with this toxic byproduct.
Exactly, and the brain is also very vulnerable to alcohol's negative effects on mitochondria, which could explain some of the cognitive and mood-related issues associated with heavy drinking.
And what about tobacco? We all know smoking is bad, but is it specifically the nicotine that's the problem?
Interestingly, nicotine in very low doses can actually act as a mild stimulant for mitochondria.
Really? So there might be some situations where it could be beneficial.
Potentially. But it's a very fine line and generally not recommended because the big concern with nicotine is that it's highly addictive and people can very easily end up using much more than a potentially low beneficial dose.
And that can lead to all sorts of negative consequences, not just for the lungs, but for overall health.
Exactly. And the other thing to keep in mind is that even if there might be some potential benefit from very low doses of nicotine, the risks associated with smoking and other forms of tobacco use far outweigh any potential benefits.
Right, it's like trying to justify eating a whole cake because it has a few blueberries on top.
Exactly. The overall picture is what matters. And when it comes to substance use, moderation and awareness are key.
Okay, so we've covered exercise and substance use. Now let's talk about what we eat. Because Dr. Palmer is pretty critical of simple dietary advice like just saying, eat more plants.
Yeah, he's saying it's a lot more nuanced than that when we're talking about metabolic health.
Because not all plants are created equal, right? Right, and it's not just about the types of food we eat, but also how those foods are processed and the overall composition of our diet.
So he stresses how crucial early life nutrition is from the mother's health during pregnancy all the way through breastfeeding.
Because those early years are so critical for shaping a baby's brain development and their lifelong risk for various health issues.
And if they're not getting the right nutrients during those critical stages, it can have lasting negative effects on their metabolism and mitochondrial function.
Exactly, and this is one of the reasons why breastfeeding is so strongly encouraged. Because breast milk provides the ideal balance of nutrients for a baby's developing brain and body.
And he talks a lot about ultra-processed foods and how they're not just bad for us because of the high-calorie content.
What's really concerning is the growing evidence linking these ultra-processed foods to a whole range of health problems, including poorer mental health.
Oh, that's interesting because we usually think of them as just contributing to things like obesity and diabetes.
Right, but they might be impacting our brains in ways we're only just beginning to understand.
And he mentions that while the direct effects of food dyes and other artificial additives on our mitochondria are still being researched, the sheer number of these chemicals we're exposed to in our modern diets is a cause for concern.
Absolutely. And the fact that many of these additives are labeled as generally regarded as safe without extensive long-term human studies is a real issue.
Especially when you consider that these foods are so pervasive in our society and often marketed directly to children.
It really highlights the need for more research in this area and for greater awareness among consumers about the potential health impacts of ultra-processed foods.
He even brought up this thought-provoking parallel to how public health efforts manage to reduce smoking rates by sort of framing it as youth standing up against big tobacco companies.
Yeah, making people feel like they're being manipulated by the industry and empowering them to make healthier choices.
And it made me wonder if a similar approach could work with ultra-processed foods, making people more aware of the tactics used to market these unhealthy products, especially to kids.
It's a compelling idea, and there's definitely a growing movement to raise awareness about the negative impacts of the food industry, but as we know, it's a powerful force.
Yeah, and we've seen examples of how industry lobbying can influence public policy even when it comes to things like food stamps.
Exactly, so it's a complex issue with a lot of layers, but ultimately comes down to empowering individuals to make informed choices about what they eat.
Okay, so moving on to another area that's been getting a lot of attention lately, the ketogenic diet and fasting. Dr. Palmer has been quite vocal about the potential benefits of these approaches, particularly for mental health.
And it's important to understand that the ketogenic diet isn't just another fad diet. It's a dietary approach that's been used for over 100 years as a proven treatment for epilepsy.
Right, it's not just some new trendy thing.
And what's remarkable is that it's shown success in controlling seizures, even in cases where medications haven't worked.
And now there's growing evidence suggesting it could also be helpful for a whole range of psychiatric disorders.
That's right. Things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety, and even eating disorders.
And Dr. Palmer has personally heard from thousands of individuals who've experienced significant improvements in their mental health by adopting a ketogenic diet.
Often for conditions that haven't responded to traditional treatments, which is really encouraging.
So what's the connection to those all-important mitochondria? Does a ketogenic diet somehow help them function better?
The research suggests that it does. And to understand why, we need to understand what the ketogenic diet actually is.
Okay, so break it down for us.
So it's a diet that's very low in carbohydrates and high in fats. And this forces the body to shift from using glucose, which comes from carbs, as its primary fuel source, to using ketones, which are produced from fat.
Okay, so it's like switching the body's energy source.
Exactly. And this metabolic switch triggers a number of beneficial changes in the body, including improvements in mitochondrial function. Well, studies in animals have shown that ketogenic interventions can improve mitophagy, which is the process by which damaged mitochondria are removed from cells.
Oh, so it's like a cellular cleanup crew.
Exactly. And it also promotes mitochondrial biogenesis, which is the creation of new, healthy mitochondria.
So you're both getting rid of the old dysfunctional mitochondria and creating new, more efficient ones.
Precisely. And that leads to an overall improvement in cellular energy production and function.
That's pretty amazing. And he also mentioned this fascinating link between our gut health and our brain, the gut-brain axis.
Yeah, and this is an area of research that's really exploding right now. We're learning more and more about how the trillions of bacteria that live in our gut can actually influence our brain function.
And he talked about this experiment in mice where they did fecal transplants from children with epilepsy who were on and off ketogenic diets.
What they found was that the mice that received the gut bacteria from kids doing well on the keto diet also had fewer seizures, potentially because of changes in mitochondrial function in their brains.
Wow, so that's suggesting that changes in the gut driven by the ketogenic diet could actually lead to improvements in brain function, potentially, by influencing mitochondria.
It really highlights the interconnectedness of our bodily systems and how changes in one area can have ripple effects throughout the body.
And what about other forms of fasting, like intermittent fasting, where you eat within a specific window each day, or longer fasting mimicking diets? Do they offer similar benefits for our mitochondria?
There's good reason to believe they do. Fasting has been practiced for centuries across different cultures, often for spiritual or health reasons.
Right. And now science is starting to catch up and understand some of the biological mechanisms at play.
Exactly. And while the research is still ongoing, initial findings suggest that these types of fasting can also promote mitophagy and mitochondrial health.
So you're giving your cells a chance to clean house and upgrade their energy systems.
And there's also some evidence that fasting can reduce inflammation and oxidative stress, which are both harmful to mitochondria.
Okay, so it seems like there's a lot of potential here, but it's important to remember that not all fasting is created equal.
Right. If you're just restricting your eating window, but still eating a very unhealthy diet during that time, you might not see the same benefits.
So it's really about combining these fasting approaches with a healthy overall lifestyle.
Exactly. And it's always a good idea to talk to your healthcare provider before making any significant changes to your diet, especially if you have any underlying health conditions.
Okay, now let's talk about supplements because there's a lot of buzz these days about things like creatine, methylene blue, and urolithin A for supporting mitochondrial health.
And it's important to start by saying that while certain supplements might offer some support, they should really be thought of as additions to a solid foundation of healthy lifestyle habits.
Right, lifestyle first, supplements second.
As Dr. Palmer emphasizes, no pill or powder can completely make up for a poor diet, lack of sleep, or chronic stress.
So they're not magic bullets, but they might be helpful extras.
Exactly. And with that in mind, let's talk about creatine. You mentioned it's popular for building muscle, but it also plays a role in how our cells use energy.
Yeah, I've heard that it can improve athletic performance, but I didn't realize it was connected to mitochondria.
Well, creatine helps our cells move energy around more efficiently, and that's important for mitochondrial function.
And it's naturally found in animal-based foods, which is interesting because you mentioned that people who are vegetarian or vegan often have lower levels.
That's right. And interestingly, lower creatine levels have also been observed in individuals with certain mental health conditions, like depression and bipolar disorder.
So supplementation might be something to consider for those individuals.
Possibly, but we need more research to confirm that. But there is some evidence suggesting that creatine supplementation might be helpful for things like depression, bipolar disorder, and even neurodegenerative conditions.
And methylene blue, I remember hearing about it in the context of keeping fish tanks clean, but now it's getting some attention for potential benefits for our mitochondria.
It is. And methylene blue is a fascinating molecule that can act as an electron cycler, meaning it can help facilitate the transfer of electrons in the mitochondria, which is a key part of energy production.
Okay, so it's like helping those little energy factories run more smoothly.
Exactly. And it might also help reduce oxidative stress, which is basically damage caused by unstable molecules called free radicals.
And oxidative stress is linked to all sorts of health problems, right?
It is. It's like rusting from the inside out. And it's thought to contribute to aging and chronic diseases.
So methylene blue might be a way to kind of counteract that process.
Potentially. But it's important to use it cautiously because too much can actually have the opposite effect.
And he mentioned that it can interact with certain medications, so it's not something to just start taking on your own.
Definitely talk to your doctor for it because they can help you determine if it's appropriate for you and what dosage would be safe.
And what about urolithin A? I've seen that advertised quite a bit lately, often associated with healthy aging.
Urolithin A is a supplement that's produced by our gut bacteria when we eat certain foods like pomegranates and berries.
Oh, interesting. So it's not something we directly consume, but it's produced by the good bacteria in our gut.
Exactly. And there's been some promising research on urolithin A, particularly in older adults.
What kind of benefits have they seen?
Well, studies have shown that it can improve muscle strength and endurance and reduce muscle wasting,
Oh,
which is a common problem as we age.
that's pretty significant because maintaining muscle mass is so important for overall health and mobility.
It is. And the thought is that urolithin A works by improving mitochondrial function in muscle cells. So it's kind of like giving those little energy factories a boost.
And he mentioned that it might have some broader metabolic benefits as well.
Yes, there's some evidence suggesting that it could help improve insulin sensitivity and reduce inflammation, which are both important for metabolic health.
So it's another potential tool in the toolkit for supporting healthy aging, but again, not a magic bullet.
Exactly, and it's important to remember that these supplements are still relatively new and more research is needed to fully understand their long-term effects.
Right. And as always, lifestyle factors should be the foundation of any health plan.
Absolutely. Supplements can be helpful additions, but they can't replace the benefits of a healthy diet, regular exercise, good sleep, and stress management.
Okay, so we've talked about lifestyle factors, substance use, and supplements. Now let's shift gears to something that might seem even more basic, vitamin and nutrient deficiencies.
Right, and Dr. Palmer emphasizes that sometimes the most overlooked factors can have a huge impact on our health, particularly when it comes to mitochondrial function.
And he specifically mentioned B12, folate, and iron as being really important.
Absolutely. These are essential nutrients that are involved in a wide range of metabolic processes, including energy production in the mitochondria.
So if we're deficient in these nutrients, our mitochondria can't function properly.
Exactly. And this can manifest in a variety of ways, including fatigue, brain fog, mood swings, and even more serious health problems.
And he mentioned that iron deficiency is surprisingly common, particularly in young women.
That's right. And it's something to be aware of because iron is crucial for brain development and function.
So it could be a contributing factor to some of the mental health challenges that we see in girls and women.
It's definitely a possibility, and something that healthcare providers should be screening for regularly.
And B12 deficiency is also a concern, especially for people who don't eat animal products.
Yes, vitamin B12 is primarily found in animal source foods. So people following vegetarian or vegan diets need to be particularly mindful of getting enough B12,
And he mentioned that low B12 levels can cause a whole range of neuropsychiatric symptoms.
including fatigue, memory problems, depression, and even psychosis in severe cases.
Wow, so it's really important to be aware of this and to supplement if necessary.
Absolutely. And if you're experiencing any of these symptoms, it's a good idea to talk to your doctor about getting your B12 levels checked.
And then he got into this really complex area of an autoimmune form of B12 deficiency that sounded pretty serious and like something most people wouldn't even know about.
It is a more recently recognized condition, and it can be tricky to diagnose because it doesn't always show up on standard blood tests.
How does it work?
Basically, the body's immune system mistakenly attacks a protein that helps transport B12 into the central nervous system.
So even if there's enough B12 in the blood, it's not getting to where it needs to go in the brain and spinal cord.
Exactly, and this can lead to a whole range of neurological and psychiatric symptoms.
And how is it diagnosed?
Currently, the most reliable way to diagnose it is through a spinal tap to measure B12 levels in the cerebrospinal fluid.
And is it treatable?
The encouraging news is that it might be treatable with medications that suppress the immune system and high doses of B12.
So it's really important for healthcare providers to be aware of this condition and to consider it in patients who are experiencing unexplained neurological or psychiatric symptoms.
Absolutely, and it highlights how sometimes the underlying causes of mental health issues can be quite complex and require more specialized investigation.
This also fascinating, and it also touches on some really complex and sometimes controversial topics, like vaccines and their potential link to mitochondrial function.
It's a sensitive area and one that requires careful consideration of the evidence.
So let's try to break it down as objectively as possible. What's the connection between vaccines and mitochondria?
Well, what we know for sure is that high levels of inflammation in the body can negatively impact mitochondrial function.
And we also know that vaccines trigger an inflammatory response as part of how they work, right?
Exactly. So the question is whether this temporary increase in inflammation could potentially have any negative effects on mitochondria, particularly in individuals who might be more vulnerable.
And he mentioned the example of a child with a pre-existing mitochondrial disorder whose symptoms worsened after vaccination.
Yes, and that case raises some important questions about the potential for individual variability in response to vaccines.
But then he also brought up the research that suggests that unvaccinated individuals might actually have a slightly higher chance of developing autism.
And this is where it gets tricky, because while some studies have shown this association, it's very difficult to control for all the other factors that might be at play.
Right, like differences in overall health and lifestyle between vaccinated and unvaccinated groups.
Exactly. So it's not a simple cause and effect relationship.
And it's important to remember that severe infections themselves can cause significant inflammation and potentially impact mitochondrial function as well.
So it's a complex risk-benefit analysis that needs to be made on an individual and societal level.
And Dr. Palmer's point seems to be that instead of just focusing on vaccines, we should be looking at the bigger picture of a child's overall health and development.
And that includes their metabolic health, their nutrient levels, and any potential underlying conditions that could make them more susceptible to problems.
He really advocates for a more thorough investigation for children who are showing signs of neurodevelopmental issues.
And he suggests that we should be looking at things like vitamin deficiencies, the possibility of central B12 deficiency, and even considering dietary interventions like the ketogenic diet in some cases.
And he points to the concerning parallel rise in both autism rates and metabolic health problems like obesity and diabetes in the U.S. population.
Suggesting that there might be a significant overlap that deserves more research.
And it's not just about weight, right? He emphasizes that metabolic health encompasses a whole range of factors.
Like blood sugar control, blood pressure, cholesterol levels, and even things like inflammation and oxidative stress.
So even someone who looks thin can be metabolically unhealthy.
Exactly, and this really highlights the need for better ways to assess someone's metabolic health.
And Dr. Palmer mentioned some exciting research happening in that area, like the development of blood tests that can look at specific biomarkers to assess how well someone's mitochondria are functioning.
That's right. There are teams working on identifying panels of biomarkers that could potentially predict someone's risk for developing certain conditions, including mental health disorders.
Wow, so imagine if we could have a simple blood test that could tell us how healthy our mitochondria are.
That would be a game changer because it could allow for earlier intervention and prevention.
And it would really shift our focus from treating diseases to optimizing health.
Absolutely. And that's really the overarching message here. Our metabolic health and the health of our mitochondria are fundamental to our overall well-being.
So for our listeners who are feeling inspired to take action, what are some practical steps they can consider?
Start by reflecting on those 6 pillars of lifestyle medicine we talked about earlier: diet, exercise, sleep, substance use, stress management, and relationships.
Those are the foundations, right?
Exactly. And even small changes in these areas can have a big impact on your metabolic health.
Like what kind of things?
Well, maybe you could start by incorporating more whole, unprocessed foods into your diet, or aiming for at least 30 minutes of moderate intensity exercise most days of the week.
Or making sure you're getting enough sleep and finding healthy ways to manage stress.
And it's also a good idea to talk to your doctor about checking your levels of key vitamins and nutrients like iron, B12, and vitamin D.
Especially if you're experiencing any symptoms that could be related to a deficiency.
Exactly. And remember that knowledge is power. The more you understand about how your body works, the better equipped you'll be to make informed decisions about your health.
It's all about empowering ourselves to take control of our well-being and to create the conditions for a long, healthy, and fulfilling life.
And this deep dive is just the beginning. We encourage you to continue exploring these topics and to keep asking questions.
Because there's always more to learn, and the more we learn, the more we realize how interconnected everything is.
And that understanding can be incredibly empowering because it reminds us that we have a lot more influence over our health than we might think.
Absolutely. So let's keep learning, keep exploring, and keep striving to be the healthiest versions of ourselves.
And we'll be here to guide you along the way with more deep dives into fascinating topics that matter to your health and well-being.